Olaf Scholz's journey began far from the bright lights of Berlin. Born in 1958 in Osnabrück, then part West Germany, he spent his formative years in Hamburg, a northern port city, where the air carries the scent of both the sea and industry. His parents were in the textile business, and their home mirrored the post-war German middle class. Orderly, modest, with a strong emphasis on education. There were no glamorous connections or a powerful family legacy. Instead, Scholz's early life instilled in him the quiet understanding that stability is earned through hard work, not simply inherited. Before we get into the main content, please consider subscribing to my channel, giving a like, leaving a comment, and share and support me in bringing more great videos to you. Thank you so much. As a teenager in the 1970s, Scholz entered the political arena through the Social Democratic Party, SPD. Joining at just 17, the Germany of his youth was still grappling with the divisions of the Cold War, ideological tensions, and the question of what democracy truly meant after the devastating events of the first half of the 20th century. Scholz found himself drawn to the SPD's youth wing, the Jusos. During those years, his views were more left-leaning than the cautious public image he would later cultivate. He passionately advocated for social justice and critiqued capitalism and NATO from a deeply idealistic perspective, something he would later describe as youthful exuberance. He pursued law at the University of Hamburg, specializing in labor and employment law. This choice reflected his practical nature. Rather than focusing on abstract theory, he wanted to engage with the tangible structures of society, workplaces, contracts, rights, and the everyday balance between businesses and the people who depend on them. After graduation, he practiced law in this field, honing two skills that would become hallmarks of his political style: meticulous attention to detail and the habit of speaking deliberately, only after carefully considering every aspect. Throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, Scholz steadily climbed the ranks within the SPD. Germany was undergoing rapid transformation. Reunification in 1990 brought both hope and anxiety, along with an immense amount of administrative work. Millions of East Germans were being integrated into Western systems. Industries needed to be rebuilt, and trust had to be reestablished. Scholz belonged to a generation of politicians who recognized that reunification was not just a historical event, but an ongoing process. Even in those early days, his temperament was noticeable. He eschewed theatrical speeches, favoring competent management, extensive meetings, and a calm demeanor. Colleagues playfully nicknamed him Scholzomat, a reference to his machine-like consistency and disciplined talking points. While intended as friendly teasing, it also captured a key aspect of his character. Scholz was built for endurance, not grand displays. In 1998, he entered the Bundestag, Germany's federal parliament, representing the SPD at the national level. This was the era of Gerhard Schröder's chancellorship, marked by a modernizing agenda within a center-left government. Scholz served in various parliamentary leadership positions, including as SPD General Secretary. This role, while not particularly glamorous, involved maintaining party unity, managing messaging, and navigating internal crises. Scholz learned firsthand how fragile coalitions can be, how quickly public sentiment can shift, and how much discipline is required to keep a large political machine running smoothly. Imagine Scholz at this stage, not a charismatic crowd pleaser, but the man in the briefing room, pen in hand, taking notes as others speak. His strength lies in control. This would become both his advantage and his burden. Many Germans trusted him for his steadfastness, while others found him too cautious, too reserved, and too slow to show emotion. In 2007, Angela Merkel invited him to join her first Grand Coalition cabinet as Minister of Labor and Social Affairs. This marked a turning point for Scholz as he transitioned from party strategy to executive power. The labor ministry is a complex domain encompassing pensions, unemployment systems, Social Security, and negotiations with unions and industry. Germany was still adapting to earlier welfare reforms, and the global financial crisis was looming. Scholz adopted a technocratic and pragmatic approach, focusing on employment stability and labor protections, always mindful of what German society could realistically afford. After the SPD's defeat at the federal level in 2009, Scholz returned to Hamburg politics. While it might have seemed like a step back, it proved to be a crucial chapter in his ascent. Hamburg, a city known for its trade, multicultural neighborhoods, and strong civic identity, provided a different landscape. In 2011, Scholz led the SPD to victory and became first mayor. For 7 years, he governed the city, overseeing transport projects, housing debates, economic modernization, and the challenges that accompany a growing, globalizing port. His reputation as a capable manager solidified. He rarely sought headlines, instead focusing on making systems work effectively. Hamburg also offered Scholz something else, a deeper understanding of how people live outside the policy circles of Berlin. Leading a city requires addressing problems at the street level. School queues, rising rents, policing protests, and the constant need to balance business interests with public needs. Scholz's tone became more centrist, not because he abandoned his core beliefs, but because governing a city demanded balance over ideological purity. By 2018, Merkel brought him back to the federal stage as finance minister and vice chancellor. While he remained a less prominent figure in the public eye, he became a pillar within the government. He managed budgets, negotiated EU economic policy, and later crafted massive rescue packages in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Many Germans began to see him as a natural successor to Merkel's style, quiet, steady, and procedural. Part 1 concludes here. Scholz, once a cautious young socialist, now a seasoned administrator standing on the cusp of national leadership. Germany was about to enter a new era, and Scholz was poised to step into the role that would define his place in history. When Olaf Scholz returned to Berlin as finance minister in 2018, he entered a ministry that holds a unique position of gravity in Germany. The finance ministry embodies the nation's cautious instincts, with a renowned black zero balanced budget policy, has long been guarded as a fundamental principle. Despite being center-left, Scholz didn't challenge this tradition head-on. He studied it, worked within its framework, and gradually learned how to adapt it when historical circumstances demanded. As vice chancellor in Angela Merkel's final grand coalition, he served as both a partner and an apprentice in a political era that Germans associate with stability. Then, the pandemic struck. COVID-19 was more than just a health crisis for Germany. It shook the country's confidence in its ability to predict the future. Factories halted operations. Schools closed, borders tightened, and the German state, accustomed to gradual change, had to act swiftly. Scholz assumed a role that was part accountant, part lifeguard. He pushed through extensive emergency packages, supporting furlough schemes and business assistance on a scale unseen in Germany during peacetime. The long-held balanced budget principle was suspended, not because Scholz favored debt, but because the economy was collapsing, and he believed the government's role was to prevent total disaster. Those months subtly reshaped his image, no longer just a party figure or a Hamburg mayor, but the steady hand capable of pressing the stabilize button when systems were faltering. In 2020, the SPD nominated him as their candidate for chancellor. It wasn't a moment of political fanfare. The SPD was struggling in the polls, worn down by years as a junior partner to Merkel's conservatives. Scholz wasn't even the most charismatic figure within the party. However, he accepted the nomination with his characteristic calm, seemingly understanding something that others only vaguely perceived. Germans were growing weary of political drama. After 15 years of Merkel, they didn't yearn for a crusader. They wanted someone who could keep things running smoothly through turbulent times. The 2021 election campaign unfolded like a slow-motion chess match. Merkel was stepping down. The conservative CDU/CSU was struggling to define itself in her absence. And the Greens were gaining momentum with their urgent message on climate change. Scholz kept his strategy simple, emphasized competence, moderation, and continuity. He spoke about respect for workers, affordable housing, digital modernization, and climate transitions that wouldn't devastate industrial jobs. He didn't try to charm crowds in a way that some of his rivals did. Instead, he positioned himself as a reliable choice, almost a Merkel-like figure wearing a red tie. On election night, the SPD secured the most votes and seats, a narrow but significant victory. Scholz had achieved something that few had anticipated. However, winning Germany was only half the battle. Governing Germany required assembling a coalition, always a test of patience and compromise. What followed was one of the most delicate negotiations of his career. Scholz aimed for the so-called traffic light coalition. SPD read, Greens green, FDP yellow. It would be the first time these three parties governed together at the federal level, and their political instincts weren't naturally aligned. The Greens pushed for more aggressive climate action. The FDP advocated for fiscal restraint and market-friendly reforms. And the SPD championed social protection and labor rights. Scholz, by nature, was well suited for this task. He listened, guided, and maintained a low profile. When the coalition agreement was finally signed, it conveyed a sense of modernizing optimism. Germany would become greener, more digital, more socially inclusive, while remaining economically competitive. On December 8, 2021, Scholz was elected and sworn in as Chancellor, marking the end of the Merkel era. The moment wasn't dramatic. He took the oath with the quiet confidence of someone who had been preparing for it for decades. His early months focused on setting a tone. The coalition acted quickly on symbolic social policies. One of the most significant was raising the statutory minimum wage to €12 an hour, implemented in October 2022, a promise that Scholz had consistently reiterated during the campaign. It mattered to millions of low-wage workers and signaled a government committed to ensuring dignity in the lower segments of the labor market. The government also began reforming welfare into what Germany called Bürgergeld, citizens' income, softening some of the harsher aspects of the previous Hartz-IV system. Scholz framed it not as charity, but as a social safety net that would make transitions in a changing economy less brutal. Alongside this were promises of accelerated housing construction, substantial investments in rail and digital networks, and a climate strategy that would promote renewable energy while safeguarding Germany's industrial core. There was a palpable sense of cautious renewal. The traffic light coalition projected a forward-leaning spirit, as if Germany were seeking to rediscover momentum after years of careful, incremental progress. Then, February 2022 arrived, bringing with it another kind of earthquake. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine shattered the assumptions that had guided German foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. For decades, Germany had viewed trade with Russia, particularly gas, as both economically logical and a strategy for peace. Suddenly, that logic crumbled. Scholz, who had been chancellor for barely 2 months, addressed the Bundestag on February 27, 2022, delivering what would become one of the defining speeches of his career. The Zeitenwende, the turning point in time. In that speech, he announced a €100 billion special fund to modernize the Bundeswehr, German armed forces, and committed Germany to meeting NATO's 2% defense spending target. For a country whose post-war identity was partly built on military restraint, this was a historic reversal. Scholz didn't present it with triumph. He spoke with the voice of a leader who understood that history had forced Germany into a new path, whether they want to take it or not. This wasn't just about weapons. It was about the fundamental principles of German policy. Scholz framed the invasion as a rupture that required Germany to rethink its approach to security, energy, and responsibility in Europe. He supported sweeping sanctions, backed military aid for Ukraine, and began preparing Germany for a painful energy transition away from Russian gas. Within weeks, Germany was scrambling to secure LNG terminals, accelerate the development of renewable energy sources, and shield households from soaring energy prices. The Chancellor's calm style became both an asset and a source of frustration. Supporters saw stability in the face of chaos, while critics wanted more speed, stronger moral declarations, and more decisive actions. Scholz continued to rely on the approach he had learned as a lawyer and administrator. Proceed carefully, but proceed nonetheless. By the time Germany entered the second half of 2022, Scholz had already experienced what most chancellors face in an entire term: pandemic recovery, a new coalition, and a war on the European continent. Yet, his personality remained largely unchanged, a quiet man in a historically tumultuous moment, striving to maintain a balance between urgency and stability. Part 2 concludes here. In the initial, storm-filled phase of his chancellorship, as Germany's long-held certainties were dissolving and a new era was beginning to take shape. Part 3 will explore the longer-term consequences of Zeitenwende, the energy crisis, economic strain, coalition tensions, and how Scholz attempted to guide Germany through the most challenging tests of his generation. The Zeitenwende speech had sounded like a decisive shift, but in reality, such pivots are never clean. In 2022 and 2023, Olaf Scholz learned a lesson that every German chancellor eventually learns. History doesn't wait for policy to catch up. The war in Ukraine didn't remain a distant headline. It permeated Germany's factories, homes, budgets, and political discourse. And the still young traffic light coalition had to navigate a pressure cooker of energy shock, inflation, and moral expectations. Germany's first battleground wasn't on foreign soil, but within its own power grid. For decades, German prosperity had relied on cheap Russian gas, piped directly into industry, heating systems, and the hidden infrastructure of daily life. When that pipeline reality shattered, Scholz's government faced a brutal equation. Keep the lights on, keep factories running, and maintain public trust, all while refusing to return to dependency. The solution emerged quickly, almost improvised at first. Floating LNG terminals on the North Sea coast, emergency contracts, and a rapid shift toward alternative suppliers. Within months, terminals at locations like Wilhelmshaven and Brunsbüttel were receiving shipments, much of it from the United States. It was a remarkably rapid transformation for a country known for its lengthy permitting processes. However, speed came at a price. Energy costs surged throughout 2022, fueling inflation and anxiety. German industry, particularly chemicals, steel, and manufacturing, felt the pressure intensify. Households received utility bills with disbelief. The government responded with relief packages, price caps, and subsidies to prevent a social breakdown. Scholz characterized these measures as defensive walls, temporary, expensive, but essential to prevent the social fabric from unraveling. At the same time, his coalition was working to accelerate the transition to renewable energy. The Greens strongly advocated for the expansion of wind and solar power and for reforming heating systems, sometimes with the urgency of those who fear time is running out. The FDP demanded fiscal discipline and expressed concerns about overregulation. Scholz stood between them, often appearing less like a commanding leader and more like a patient mediator trying to keep three distinct engines synchronized. The tensions didn't remain abstract. They manifested as disagreements over budgets, timelines, and the very definition of progress. Then, in late 2023, another blow struck. Not from Moscow, but from Karlsruhe, where Germany's constitutional court ruled that the government couldn't repurpose and use pandemic debt for climate and transformation spending. The decision created a roughly €60 billion hole in Scholz's financial plans, triggering emergency cuts, political bitterness, and a new wave of public skepticism. Farmers protested, ministries scrambled, and the coalition's internal divisions widened into cracks that were visible to everyone. While energy and budget shook the domestic landscape, foreign policy continued to test Scholz's instincts. Germany became one of Ukraine's largest supporters in Europe, but Scholz's caution repeatedly clashed with the impatience of allies. The debate over Leopard 2 tanks became emblematic. Critics accused Scholz of hesitating for too long, fearing escalation, while supporters argued that he was preventing Germany from taking reckless steps. Only after months of pressure, and after the U.S. agreed to send Abrams tanks, did Scholz authorize the transfer of Leopard tanks in January 2023. The decision was historic, but the delay shaped his image, a leader who acts, but only after meticulously assessing every risk. Still, the shift in defense policy didn't stop at tanks. The €100 billion special fund for the Bundeswehr began to be used for procurement and modernization, and Scholz linked this to Germany's broader role in NATO and EU security. However, rebuilding an army after years of underinvestment is a slow process, and public debate often centered on whether Germany could translate its new rhetoric into tangible capabilities. Scholz consistently reiterated the same message. Germany would be reliable, but not impulsive. By 2023, the mood in Germany had shifted from shock to weariness. People were proud that the country had avoided gas shortages and prevented a deep recession, yet many felt squeezed by rising costs and unsettled by uncertainty. The coalition's popularity declined, and Scholz himself often seemed steady but detached, struggling to convey emotion at a time when emotions were running high. Some Germans wanted a wartime orator. Scholz wasn't built that way. He was built like a civil engineer. Reinforce a bridge, don't dramatize the river. Internationally, he attempted to balance two realities. First, Europe had to support Ukraine long-term. Second, Germany's economic engine couldn't be sacrificed in the process. His government advocated for EU unity on sanctions and aid, but also argued for careful consideration. Always a lawyer seeking to avoid unintended consequences in history's contract. Within the coalition, each new crisis tightened the tensions. The Greens worried about climate momentum slipping under the weight of war and fiscal constraints. The FDP feared debt and the expansion of the state. The SPD feared social divisions and industrial decline. Scholz continually tried to translate these fears into workable compromises. However, even when agreements were reached, they often felt like temporary fixes rather than fundamental solutions. By late 2024, these tensions finally broke the coalition apart. Scholz dismissed Finance Minister Christian Lindner after lengthy disputes over economic direction and the debt brake. The FDP left the government, transforming the traffic light coalition into a red-green minority. Scholz then called and lost a vote of confidence, opening the way for early elections in February 2025. It was a dramatic end to an alliance that had begun with optimistic talk of more progress. Looking back at this period of his chancellorship, you can see Scholz in his most revealing light. He didn't abandon stability when the ground shook. He tried to preserve it by guiding Germany through structural change without panic. Sometimes that calm appeared as strength. Sometimes it looked like hesitation. But it was consistent with a man introduced in earlier parts of the story, a leader who believes that endurance is its own form of courage. If part 3 was a storm, part 4 is the extended aftermath, the period when the consequences of the crisis settled into everyday politics. By 2024, Olaf Scholz was no longer the new chancellor of a promising traffic light experiment. He was a chancellor of a country grappling with multiple overlapping pressures, a war on Europe's eastern border, a persistently weak economy, a culture war surrounding climate policy, and a coalition whose internal trust was diminishing with each passing month. From the outside, Germany still appeared stable. The lights were on, gas storage was full, and industry had avoided collapse. But stability had become expensive and emotionally draining. Many Germans felt they were paying a double price. Once through higher prices, and again to the constant feeling that the ground beneath Europe was shifting. Scholz tried to address this weariness with his most natural tool, calm. He spoke of perseverance, of not allowing ourselves to be driven by panic, of guiding Germany through change without tearing society apart. To supporters, it was reassuring. To critics, it sounded like a repetitive echo of cautious phrases while the country yearned for sharper direction. The central battleground of 2024 was finance. After the Constitutional Court struck down the government's debt maneuver in late 2023, Scholz's coalition entered a budget crisis that never truly ceased. The ruling left a gaping hole in funding for climate and infrastructure, and it transformed every policy discussion into a struggle over what Germany could still afford. The Greens sought to protect climate spending and accelerate the energy transition. The FDP insisted that the debt brake must not be weakened and demanded cuts and market-driven solutions. The SPD, Scholz's own party, feared that austerity would fracture social trust and fuel extremism. In private meetings that stretched late into the night, Scholz attempted to do what he had always done in politics: sit at the center and transform contradiction into compromise. But by 2024, compromise felt less like bridge building and more like emergency patchwork. The public felt the strain. Farmers protested against subsidy cuts, local governments complained about investment gaps, and businesses requested more certainty. Each group viewed the crisis from its own perspective, but all of them looked to the Chancellery for answers. Scholz offered a strategy that was pragmatic but controversial: loosen fiscal rules under emergency clauses to preserve long-term investments. For the FDP, this crossed a red line. For the Greens and SPD, it was reality. The gap between these positions became virtually impossible to bridge. Then, November 2024 arrived, and the coalition shattered. Scholz dismissed Finance Minister Christian Lindner after months of budget warfare, and the FDP left the government. The traffic light coalition, which had begun with optimism, collapsed into a red-green minority administration. Germany had experienced coalition tensions before, but the emotional tenor of this moment was different. Not surprise, but resignation. Many Germans had watched the relationship deteriorate in real time. Scholz now faced a constitutional and political choice. Minority government was legally permissible but practically unstable. If Germany was to regain momentum, it needed clarity. So Scholz took the step that German chancellors rarely take unless compelled. He requested a vote of confidence from Parliament, expecting to lose it, so that a snap election could be triggered. On December 16, 2024, he lost that vote. Within days, President Frank-Walter Steinmeier dissolved Parliament and confirmed early elections for February 23, 2025. The subsequent campaign was unlike Scholz's understated 2021 run. This time, he was defending a record shaped by crisis rather than promising a future. His message centered on investment, industrial renewal, and a Germany that should not retreat into austerity or fear. But voters were restless. The CDU/CSU, under Friedrich Merz, led in the polls, promising stricter migration policies and a more business-oriented economic approach. The far-right AfD surged to an unprecedented second place in national support, especially in eastern Germany. Fueled by discontent with rising costs, identity politics, and disillusionment with mainstream parties. The political atmosphere felt sharper, more anxious, and less patient. On election night, February 23, 2025, Scholz's SPD suffered a significant defeat, falling to around 16% of the vote, far behind the CDU/CSU, while the AfD rose dramatically. The traffic light parties all lost ground. Scholz remained as caretaker chancellor during coalition talks, but the verdict was clear. Germany wanted a different leader for the next phase of turbulence. By May 2025, Merz formed a coalition with the SPD and was elected chancellor after a tense two-round vote, an episode that highlighted how fragile Germany's new political era had become. Scholz, stepping down from the chancellery, didn't disappear from politics, but his role transitioned from decision-maker to legacy figure. And legacy is where Scholz's story becomes quietly complex. For supporters, he will be remembered as a chancellor who absorbed 3 once-in-a-generation shocks: pandemic aftermath, energy rupture, and war, without allowing Germany to descend into chaos. They emphasize how quickly LNG infrastructure was built, how social price caps prevented widespread hardship, how Ukraine was supported on a large scale, and how Germany finally accepted responsibility for European security through the Zeitenwende. To them, Scholz's calm was not a weakness, but a form of civic protection, the refusal to add political drama to an already dramatic world. To critics, he will be remembered differently. A leader whose caution was sometimes indistinguishable from delay, a communicator who struggled to connect with the emotions of the public, and a coalition manager who couldn't prevent his government from collapsing under fiscal and ideological pressure. For them, the rise of the AfD during his term was not just a consequence of global shocks, but also a reflection of a political center that failed to reassure people quickly enough. Both perspectives will likely shape the long-term assessment of Olaf Scholz's chancellorship. Here's a refined translation of the provided text, aiming for clarity and a touch of interpretive expansion, while maintaining the original structure and tone. Scholz's readings of situations contain truth. He led Germany during a period when its established model faced serious challenges, an economy reliant on exports now strained by geopolitical shifts, an energy infrastructure compelled to undergo a rapid transformation, and a society grappling with climate change, war, migration, and rising inflation. No leader could have navigated these conflicting pressures without causing some pain. Scholz chose to manage them with a steady, administrative hand, rather than as a charismatic visionary, a style for which Germany felt both grateful and somewhat impatient. When Olaf Scholz left the Chancellery in 2025, Germany did not feel like a nation calmly closing a chapter. Instead, it felt as though the country was crossing a bridge shrouded in fog, aware of the ground it had covered, yet uncertain of what lay ahead. Scholz's departure was marked not by a grand, era-defining speech, but by the same quiet consistency that had always characterized him. He ceded power to Friedrich Merz's new CDU/CSU SPD coalition following the snap election of February 23, 2025, and the subsequent tense parliamentary vote that confirmed Merz as chancellor on May 6, 2025. Yet, Scholz's story, like Germany's, doesn't conclude on a specific date. History judges leaders not only by their intentions, but also by the circumstances that shape their actions. Scholz governed during a time when Germany was forced to constantly reevaluate itself. Listening closely to German discourse about his tenure, one can discern two distinct narratives. One narrative portrays him as a chancellor of stabilization, the leader who maintained structure amidst relentless crises. Under his guidance, Germany weathered energy disruptions without blackouts, rapidly developed LNG infrastructure, and mitigated the worst effects of inflation through social safety nets and targeted assistance. The state didn't succumb to panic, and the economy, though strained, didn't collapse. While not glamorous, this narrative values endurance, a significant virtue in German political culture. The other narrative depicts him as a chancellor of hesitation, often acting only after the situation had already evolved. Critics cite delayed decisions regarding heavy weapons for Ukraine, unclear messaging on climate reforms, and a coalition plagued by public disagreements and budgetary gridlock. In this view, Scholz's calmness becomes a liability, too measured for a public yearning for decisive leadership. Both narratives hold elements of truth. Scholz's legacy lies somewhere in the interplay between them. To truly understand it, one must recognize the magnitude of the challenges he faced. Germany's post-Cold War identity had been built on a specific framework: peace through economic interdependence, security largely outsourced to NATO, industrial strength powered by stable globalization and affordable Russian energy, and domestic change managed through consensus. Between 2021 and 2025, this entire framework fractured. The invasion of Ukraine compelled Germany to undergo a Zeitenwende, its most significant foreign policy shift since reunification. Scholz's February 2022 speech not only announced a €100 billion defense fund, it signaled to Germans that history had returned as a central force, and that security could no longer be taken for granted. The energy crisis forced Germany to overhaul its economic lifeblood in a matter of months. The Constitutional Court's debt break, ruling in late 2023, led to fierce debates over the nation's future, with fewer resources and heightened tension. Clean energy wire. Underlying these immediate crises were longer-term trends: demographic aging, digital stagnation, a fragmented media landscape, growing distrust in institutions, and the rise of the far right as a reaction to these issues. The surge in support for the AfD in the 2025 election served as both a judgment on the present and a warning about the future. Scholz didn't create these challenges, but he had to govern within them. In this sense, he appears as a transitional figure, a bridge between Merkel's era of cautious continuity and the more turbulent politics that followed. Merkel's time was about preserving stability within a predictable global order. Scholz's was about maintaining stability as that order unraveled. He sought to achieve this through process, by maintaining coalitions for as long as possible, by allowing ministries to debate until compromises emerged, and by waiting for European partners and the U.S. to act in concert before Germany took its own steps. This approach stemmed from his background, from labor law, where a single clause can be transformative, from governing Hamburg, where the city had to function even during difficult times, and from the SPD's tradition of negotiation over confrontation. However, process is slow, and the 2020s were not. As Germany transitioned into the MERS era, it carried forward many of Scholz's unfinished tasks. The defense pivot initiated under his leadership still requires full implementation. Modernizing the Bundeswehr remains a long and expensive endeavor. The energy transition must still accelerate without undermining industrial competitiveness. The social contract needs renewal to prevent discontent from fueling extremism. Scholz's term also left a subtle cultural mark on Germany. The country became more aware of geopolitical realities. It learned that trade doesn't automatically guarantee peace, that energy dependence can be a strategic vulnerability, and that democracy can be undermined not only by external enemies but also by internal fatigue. Even those who disagreed with Scholz's style often acknowledged this. Germany emerged from his term with a greater awareness of the world. In the months following his departure, Scholz maintained his characteristic caution. He didn't attempt a dramatic return or dominate the media. Instead, he returned to the Bundestag as a seasoned statesman within the SPD, while the party began to reorganize under younger leadership after the 2025 defeat. public perception of him will continue to evolve. If Europe stabilizes and Ukraine secures its future, Scholz may be remembered as the leader who helped Germany adapt in time. If Europe descends into deeper fragmentation, critics may argue that he acted too slowly at a crucial moment in history. But history is rarely so clear-cut. The truth may be simpler. Scholz was a chancellor whose character, steady, legalistic, and compromise-driven, mirrored Germany's instincts at a time when the world demanded speed, clarity, and, at times, dramatic action. And yet, there is something inherently human in his approach to governance. He didn't promise miracles or cloak his decisions in grand narratives. He approached leadership like a careful builder constructs a bridge. Reinforce, measure, then step forward. Millions of Germans found that reassuring. Millions found it insufficient. That tension defines the essence of his legacy.